Okay, so this is the chapter 14, How Biological Diversity Evolves, and you should have your outline with you as you follow along with this lecture. All right, so this cartoon says, I'm not a new species, it's a perm. This little bird got a perm. So we have to talk about what defines a species and then talk about what changes create new species. All right, so what is a species? Species is this definition here. So it's a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So fertile offspring means that that offspring is also able to reproduce its own kind. And so the example I have is an example of two species that, well, a horse and a donkey. These are separate species because when a horse and a donkey mate, they create a mule. So horses and donkeys have the potential to interbreed, so this happens in nature, but do they produce a fertile offspring? And the answer is no, because the mule that they create is sterile. Mules cannot mate to make another mule. So in this example, horses and donkeys are clearly not the same species because they don't have the ability to make a fertile offspring. Okay, so in order for something to be considered the same species, they both interbreed naturally and they produce fertile offspring that can then perpetuate the same species. Let me just also add that the potential to interbreed has to be in nature. It can't be in a zoo or in an artificial environment. If you force two different species to interbreed, sometimes you can, but that doesn't normally happen in nature. So we have to think about what's happening in the world outside of sort of man-made artificial environments. Okay, so the letter A in your outline, speciation, is the process in which one species will split into two or more species. And then I do have a note down here that the concept of species that we're talking about right now really refers to sexually reproducing organisms like animals and plants. When you start thinking about bacteria or viruses or organisms that actually can asexually reproduce, and they usually do asexually reproduce, then the species definition, this one, breaks down, right? You can't use this definition to talk about bacteria because bacteria's offspring, they actually reproduce asexually. So when scientists are looking at how to categorize those kinds of organisms like bacteria, they look at the similarity in DNA, and then they look at the similarity of their genes, and they can determine whether something falls within the same species or not. All right, so let's take a look at some reproductive barriers because we want to look at this potential to interbreed. So the first step here is there are certain barriers in place that are called prezygotic barriers, and these prevent the zygote from being formed. So remember, a zygote is a fertilized egg. So what is it that can prevent a fertilized egg from happening? And there's three here. And then we're going to go through these individually. And then there's a mating attempt. So even if those two organisms attempt to mate, something goes wrong. Okay, so there's different barriers here, even if they attempt. And then even if a zygote forms, right? So that now we have a post-zygotic barrier. So even after mating happens and after you have an offspring, what happens to the offspring? Okay, so there's problems here. So let's look at each one. So the first prezygotic barrier, so this is barriers that make it not likely, right, or unlikely that these two populations will not come together and breed, is that they have their sort of mating seasons at different times. So this one is skunk species. They mate at different times of year. So when one population is ready to mate, the other one's not. So that sort of keeps them apart. Their mating habits are separate, and that is a prezygotic barrier. So it's temporal, temporal meaning time, right? The time is wrong, timing is off. The next one is habitat isolation. So there may be two snakes here that maybe have the potential to interbreed, but they don't because they have different habitats. So the garter snake there's an aquatic form and then there's a land terrestrial form, and they never come across each other in nature to mate. Okay, so that's habitat isolation. The third one, behavioral isolation. This is really fun. I'll link this to your Canvas so you can see this dance, but there are lots of sort of, in the bird community or the bird species, especially, there are very complex dances and mating rituals that have to be done correctly in order for mating to happen. And so the blue-footed booby here is an example. They have a very fun little dance. But also there are spiders that have mating rituals, and all different kinds of animals have different mating rituals. So behaviorally, you can be isolated from another bird, for example, if you're not producing the right dance or if you're not doing the right dance. All right, so mechanical isolation is you're physically trying to mate, as in these two snails, right? But their genitals actually don't align. So they're in different spots because they're different species. And so that physically or mechanically isolates them from mating. And then the last one is gametic isolation. So let's say or let's look at these sea urchins. So the way that they mate is that the males and females will just kind of release their gametes into the water, right? So in the water, floating around, is a bunch of eggs and a bunch of sperm. And so the water carries the egg towards the sperm and you have fertilization. However, gametes, so there are particular proteins on the surface of eggs and particular proteins on the surface of sperm that have to match in order for fertilization to take place. And so if they don't match, then the cells won't fertilize each other, or the sperm won't fertilize the egg. And that's called gametic isolation. So the gametes themselves, right, the sperm and egg, the proteins on the surface don't interlock. They're unable to fuse. So those are all the prezygotic barriers. So postzygotic barriers. So let's say that we actually do have mating, a zygote is formed, and it's brought to term, right? So we have an organism. Well, what are the barriers here? Is reduced hybrid viability. Viability is a term for how healthy something is. In this case, we have I don't know if it looks sick to you, it kind of looks sick to me, a salamander of some sort or a newt that just is unhealthy and will not produce offspring on its own. So sometimes they have a shorter lifespan, sometimes they are just have a weaker immune system or just not as healthy as something that was created from the same species. So this is a hybrid, right? Because the parents were two different species and the viability has been reduced. We looked at this already, right? Reduced hybrid fertility, where mules are pretty healthy organisms. They help carry, pack mules, for example, help carry heavy things up and down mountains for people. And so mules are pretty healthy. They have a pretty good lifespan, but they are sterile. They're not fertile. And then lastly, we have something called hybrid breakdown. So this is basically when the next generation, so you see this is a parent, the tall plant. This is the hybrid offspring, small. So there's some breakdown in terms of size and health. So the offspring are smaller, weaker, and usually do not reproduce, okay? Or they don't reproduce, they're sterile. So that is hybrid breakdown. And you see this in plants. You don't see hybrid breakdown in animals. Okay, so those are all the barriers. Here is a question for you. I'll let you read it and you can pause the video here. If you didn't pause, I'll just give you the answer. So identify each of the following reproductive barriers as prezygotic or postzygotic. So if the two plants live in different soils, this is going to be a prezygotic barrier. And that's going to fall under habitat isolation. Letter B, mallard and pintail ducks mate at different times of the year. This is going to be pre-zygotic, and this is going to be temporal isolation. And then the hybrid offspring of two species of Jimson weed always die before reproducing. This is going to be post-zygotic, right, because we have offspring already. And then they die before reproducing. So this is definitely a post-zygotic barrier, and it's probably hybrid breakdown, okay? All right, so now let's talk about mechanisms of speciation. So how does one population of organisms, in this case we have trees, begin to speciate? And so because our definition is they have to be in the same area to be able to interbreed, and their offspring need to be able to interbreed, what we can do is drive a barrier between these two trees. So in this allopatric speciation, it's a physical barrier. Okay, so it's a geographical isolating barrier that happens over time, or it could be very rapid. It could be an earthquake happens and we have a deep divide in a canyon or something like that. And then there's this other kind of sympatric speciation where you have speciation happen, but you are sharing the same geographical location, but there's something that changes within a population of trees that allows for them to be different enough where they don't interbreed anymore. Okay, so it's easier to maybe understand this allopatric speciation. So here's another image of allopatric speciation where you physically have some sort of barrier that causes a population to split. And so the parent population split become unique. So one way, this example here, right, you have these squirrels, and they are inhabiting two different sides of the Grand Canyon. So they don't come into contact with each other. They're isolated via habitat, and they don't interbreed. Or you can have something where individuals break off and colonize a new location, right? Some kind of remote location, and become isolated. And then over time, they don't interbreed with that parent population anymore, and so that's a different species. So here's an example of sympatric speciation where this one is looking at apple maggot flies, and they're occupying the same geographical location, but some of the flies are started to feed on one certain kind of apple tree, and another subset of those flies will start to breed and prefer to feed on another kind of apple tree, hawthorn apples. So because they are now feeding on different food varieties, right, they are starting to reduce the flow. The gene flow has been reduced, and over time they can start to specialize to just those geographical locations. Even though it's the same region, the niches, the word niche just means like the very specific part of that environment can change. And so because of this, these flies do not come in contact with each other, and they'll start to diverge just who they mate with, right? So it's kind of another habitat isolation, but more within one geographical location. So they just start to change their behavior and have that. So if you look at your notes under sympatric speciation, this is speciation without a geographical isolation. So there's nothing geographically separating these flies, right? In this example, they're just choosing to feed on different sources of food. So this is more at number 2, a habitat complexity, where the organism begins to use different aspects of their environment differently. Another example I have in the notes is basically shallow versus deep water. So if you have a population of fish, and some of those fish tend to like the shallower waters and feed on the little critters that exist there, and then some of the fish go deeper down, you're sort of using the habitat differently, and over time you can start to you just don't come into contact with the other population to interbreed, and so you start to separate your breeding practices. Okay, so the other ones just to talk about, number 1, polyploidy. An accident during cell division creates an extra set of chromosomes. So this is really interesting. So this is a mutation polyploidy happens in plants because if animals all of a sudden got a second set or a new set of chromosomes, that would not be compatible with life. That's not, it's too big of a change for a healthy animal to bear. So this is a plant item. So sometimes a strawberry can actually, just out of a mistake of meiosis, like have an extra set of chromosomes, and it still is able to reproduce itself, but it won't breed, right? It won't crossbreed with other strawberries with a normal set of chromosomes. So polyploidy is just in plants. Oh, I'm sorry, fish and amphibians. Oh, I forgot I put that in the notes. So fish and amphibians and 80% of plants diverge this way. Okay, so you just have another set of chromosomes just by accident. And then number 3, sexual selection. Members of one sex begin to select for traits that causes an eventual barrier to mating with the larger population. Okay, sorry if I paused to find you an example so you can look at this while I'm talking about sexual selection. So let's just take a look at these fish. So these fish occupy 2 different depths of water. The variation in these fish, they can come in a bluish color or a reddish color. And you can see that at different depths of water, there's different sensitivity to light, right? At this depth, sensitivity to blue light and blue coloration is favored. At this depth, sensitivity to red light and red coloration is favored. So over generations, right, over many generations, the 2 parts of the population have diverged. Blue males that wander down deeper water are unsuccessful because in the deeper water, right, red is preferred. And the red males that wander up are unsuccessful. Females prefer males from their own region because their colors match the female's color sensitivity. So it's a way of, they are diverging, right? They're not going to be able to mate with each other anymore because of this preference of the females in this case. And the preference, causes them to be unable to reproduce, which is that definition of speciation again, right? We have to have the ability to reproduce, okay? And this is because of sexual preference. All right, I just want to show you one picture of polyploidy before we leave this subject. So this is polyploid strawberries. Have you ever wondered, like I have, when you buy a strawberry plant and you grow your own strawberries, the strawberries are very small, but the ones you get at the grocery store are gigantic. So these larger strawberries are polyploid. They have doubled their chromosome number, I think, or 4 times their chromosome number. I can't remember, but they have many more chromosomes than the wild strawberry type. So in plants, it turns out that the more sets of chromosomes you have make the plant bigger, and so these bigger strawberries are polyploid. It's kind of an interesting example of something that you can point at the grocery store and say that's polyploid. All right, so we're going to stop for this section here. Although I just remember we need to talk about this slide before we stop. All right, so let's say, right, that we have these 2 scenarios of populations diverging, right? So we have a population that has diverged because of some barrier. So this would be allopatric speciation. But let's say they come around the barrier and they meet again. If they are able to again then interbreed, then did they successfully become 2 species? No, they didn't, right? No speciation because they can still interbreed. This was a temporary just barrier for them. Sorry about that, you guys. However, over time, if this geographical barrier kept them apart and they diverged so that when they do come back in contact with each other, they still do not interbreed, then speciation has occurred. Now we can call them 2 different species. All right, I hope that makes sense to everybody.